probably. If you're in Barolo, it's Nebbiolo. It forces you to kind of ask that second question, or just forget about the whole thing and just keep your focus on these regions. And I think that has a lot to do with the sort of localized history of winemaking in Europe, that you drink what grows near you, and that over time developed into the sort of modern wine market, which is pretty cool. Now, I hope everyone has one of these little sheets, because Jen put this great little map of Rioja on here. But what this map lacks, though it's wonderful and colorful, it does lack a little bit of sort of geographic context. So, to zoom out on this map a little bit, Rioja is in the north of Spain. You're about 60 miles south of the northern coast of Spain, and about the same distance away from the Pyrenees Mountains, which divide France from Spain. So it's actually quite far north. And despite being, only 60 miles from the coast, it's not super influenced by the coastal climate. So it sits on this sort of vast plateau that runs east to west. And then the western part of it goes up in altitude quite a bit. They call that the Rioja the Rioja Alta, sort of the high Rioja. And then the eastern part of that plateau is the Rioja Baja, which is flatter, drier, hotter, and produces a kind of a different style of wine. So the first wine that we have tonight, the Rio Madre, is coming from that eastern part, the flatter, hotter part, and then the western part, will be the other two wines tonight. So again, we'll kind of get a good broad view of the area. Rioja has been a wine growing region since even before the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula. The Phoenicians brought grapes there. So we're looking at thousands and thousands of years of grape growing history right here in Rioja, which is pretty cool. But it really didn't enter into the sort of global wine picture until much later in the 1800s. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Like I said, the Romans definitely developed viticulture in Spain, as they did everywhere around the Mediterranean. And so that is where it really production ramped up, so that the local, Roman consuls or whatever could have good wine a little bit easier to access than shipping it from Italy. Go figure. So basically, the wine history of this region kind of trucks along from, about 200 BC when the Romans conquered it. Really, like I said, pretty consistently. It started to get noticed around the Renaissance in the 1450s, 1500s. People started writing about it. And as they traveled Europe, they sort of mentioned, hey, we had some wines from this part of northern Spain that were pretty cool. And then as we head into the 1800s, suddenly there is this massive burst of interest in Spanish wine for a variety of reasons. The sort of key crucial thing here is the distance between Rioja, like I said, and France. So in the southwest of France, there's a little known wine growing region called Bordeaux that hopefully maybe one or two of you have heard of. And it's really not too far north of the Pyrenees Mountains in the Bay of Biscay there to get to Bordeaux. Like I said, we're also just 60 miles from the northern coast of Spain near the port of Bilbao, which remains today the major port where we export our wine out of Bilbao still today. They've been exporting wine out of there for a very, very long time. So you have these two major ports very close together is super important, because in the 1850s and 60s, there was an emergence of a blight on wine called phylloxera, which would sort of cruise its way all the way across Western Europe, decimating vineyards all over France, Italy, really everywhere. It's a louse that attacks the roots of the vines and just completely destroys them. Within a few years, ancient 100-year-old vineyards had just been completely wiped off the face of the earth. And at that time, the colonial power in the world was still England, and the English had a insatiable thirst for good wine. And not being able to satisfy that thirst from France in the way they had become accustomed, suddenly their attention turned south of the Pyrenees, where phylloxera hadn't quite made its way over the mountains yet. And you had this sort of boom in Rioja wine production and interest. In fact, a lot of the key Bordeaux wine producers, winemakers, came down to Spain at that time to sort of help nurture them along. And I mean, to be quite honest, just get a cut of the market, and so they could get some money rolling back home in France, because it was really bad. It would take about 50 or 60 years for phylloxera to really get a hold of Spain in the early 1900s, about 1901. And at that point, it began a series of really unfortunate events for Rioja and really Spain in general. You had, you know, the Spanish Civil War, you had the First World War, you had the Great Depression, you had the Second World War, you had Franco and the fascists. You know, it was a pretty grim first half of a century for Spain. You know, if you've read Hemingway or anything like that, it's not a pretty picture, despite the romance that you could imagine of the Civil War. And Rioja really suffered as a wine growing region throughout that period. The New World, you know, American drinkers really didn't have any interest in Rioja, and France and Italy had overcome their phylloxera and sort of rebounded in the early 20th century. And so most of the sort of interest was still on those sort of old school core areas of Burgundy and Bordeaux and, you know, parts of Tuscany and things like that. And so it took until the second half of the 20th century for Rioja to really get back out there and be recognized as one of the great wine producing regions of the world, and of Europe specifically. That kind of back and forth between the French Bordeaux winemakers and the Spanish actually ended up producing another sort of foreseen positive consequence, and it was the introduction of oak barrel aging to Rioja. For the longest time, oak barrels specifically, were not really used much in Rioja wine production. You had a lot of the sort of ancient methods of amphora, or they would just put it into a vat of whatever type of wood they could get their hands on, but there was no real concentrated effort to oak their wines. And the introduction of small French oak barrels really helped. They immediately noticed the change in the quality of the wine, because oak aging a wine has some really positive effects on many red grapes and some white grapes. It's certainly an interesting change. It's not always positive, but it's often positive. These were relatively small barrels, so you had a lot of, you know, the ratio of oak to juice was fairly high. And so you got a lot of that strong vanilla and coconut influence that helps soften some of these kind of intense wines that they grow in this region. In like the 1860s, 1870s, the Spanish were kind of sick of buying barrels from the French. They're very expensive. They remain very expensive today. It can be, you know, over $2,000 for a new barrel, often if it's French oak. The best ones command prices that are 2 or even 3 times that amount. And that's why certain wines can also be more expensive. But they found that American oak, it was actually cheaper to import lumber from the Americas, bring it over, and then make the barrels there in Spain, and they could get that done for a lot less money. And American oak has a slightly different effect on wine. And it turned out that it actually had an arguably better impact on the grapes that they were using in the Rioja region. So it's kind of just a fortuitous accident that they're like, oh wow, American oak plus Spanish wine equals something kind of cool. To kind of bring us back into the mid 20th century, you know, after 1970, which happened to be a great vintage in Rioja for a variety of reasons, Americans started to notice, the French, the English, you know, the sort of wine consumers of the world started to notice, hey, these wines are really good. But they were also really inexpensive relative to their French and even Italian counterparts. And they remain so today. The like Reserva, Gran Reserva levels of Spanish wine, you know, they're not cheap by any means, but relative to, you know, I could spend $50 or $60, $70 on a bottle of Gran Reserva Spanish Rioja, or I could spend that on like a middling like Napa Cabernet or a Chardonnay, and the quality that you will get from that Spanish wine is going to be orders of magnitude greater than it would be for that New World kind of cult wine that someone really just, it's more of a function of they have the gall to charge that much for it, that people are willing to pay it, versus the Spanish, who are willing to hold their wines back for 10 plus years before they'll release them. A lot of Gran Reservas that are in the market now are vintage 2012, and that's like the most recent release for them. So they'll sit on it, they'll wait, and they're not going to upcharge you for that. You know, this one of the producers we'll drink tonight, Bodegas Muga, they're sort of higher end, not their highest end wine, but one of their top wines called Prado Anea. We are just ending the 2011 cycle of that wine, and we'll begin to bring in the 2012 next year. So it shows you that there's also a lot of passion and care that goes into this wine, that they're not just trying to push plonk out into the market to make money, that they actually care about the finished product. As an aside to that, those of you with the bottles, the actual bottles of wine, will notice that on the Ramirez del Piscina, it had this like gold wire thing on it. And you see that sometimes in Spanish wine. And there's a couple, I think, California producers who maybe do it as well. And it's a nod to how they used to prevent counterfeiting of these wines, because they were, even back 100+ years ago, they were super focused on the quality of their wines and how they could stand out in the world. And this gold little wire that they would put over the top of it, once you cut that, it was really hard to fix it. And back then, you know, Joe Schmo peasant grifter couldn't just like drink the good juice, pour some plonk into it and resell it to the English. This became their sort of intellectual property protection, I guess, for lack of a better term. And it doesn't really serve that purpose any longer, but it is a nod to that sort of historical basis of, we are really passionate about the wine we make. We want to make sure that the wines we make, you know, make it to market and do nothing but promote the quality of our region and the quality of our wine. So that's a cool little side note there, although it is kind of a pain in the ass. I always just cut it off and get rid of it, generally. Let's see, let's get back to a little bit of geography. So I'm going to switch back to this map again. And we're going to talk about our first wine as well, which is going to be the Rio Madre, which, for those of you with the sample bottles, again, it's the one that says Olurche on it. As I mentioned, on your wonderful map here that Jen provided, we're looking at the eastern part here, so the part on the right in the Rioja Baja. At the top of the far right-hand side of this pink section is kind of a big black blob. It's the biggest, darker section in that pink area. I can't really read the word, but that is the approximate area where the grapes for this wine are going to come from. The key grapes in the region of Rioja are number one, absolutely not argued, would be Tempranillo. Number 2 would be Garnacha or Grenache. And then number 3 would be this grape, Graciano. Now, in the higher altitude western part of the Rioja, Graciano is used as a blending grape. So they make these really intense, really powerful, really grippy Tempranillo wines. And when you grow Graciano at a higher altitude in a cooler climate, it tends to be this sort of very light, very bright, very floral, really quite aromatic grape. And so they can blend that in to soften the kind of rough edges of the Tempranillo. And that's not uncommon in most of the great wine growing regions of the world. If you drink a really nice bottle of Chianti, most of it will be Sangiovese, but they'll blend in a little bit of Colorino or Ciligiolo or these weird random grapes that we've never heard of, because really their sole function has been historically to just sort of blend into these other wines that need a little softening around the edge. However, when you grow Graciano in a lower altitude, warmer climate, rather than being sort of light and ethereal, it actually develops some really interesting character of its own. And that is what this Rio Madre Graciano is. It's super uncommon to see a varietal bottling of this grape. So it's very unique in that regard. I've maybe seen 1 or 2 others in my career. This one is exceptionally good. I opened this bottle yesterday and it was wonderful then, and it has continued to evolve over the last 24 hours. Again, those of you with the full bottles, if you can spare a little bit of that juice tonight, I'm not saying you should, but if you can, you will find a very different wine drinking experience tomorrow with all 3 wines. They will evolve very gracefully over 24 hours. Looking at that crowd though, I'm thinking those bottles are already empty, aren't they? Yeah. But in any case, the Graciano here is just a gorgeous, gorgeous wine. So let's maybe take a moment and get our nose in the glass and have a little drink ski, shall we? Pour a little bit from
back on that. I actually, the one that you guys are enjoying right now, I actually liked better first day. And then the next 2 we're going to try, I liked better, I liked same day. And then the other 2, they progressively got even better, even though they tasted great, fresh opening. But there's so much fruit in this Rio Madre. I just really, really loved it. So if you are contemplating going back and revisiting after we do the tasting, if you have the full bottles, drink that one tonight and then save the other 2 for tomorrow and see how they progress. That's just my opinion.
Here's an interesting question from Amber about storing wine. If you're going to store a partially consumed bottle for more than 24 hours, if you have one of those little suction Delios, that's all great. If you are planning on just drinking it the next night with dinner, just stick a cork in it and it'll be fine. If it's I would say generally European wine does pretty well the next day. I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb is it will be different for sure, but it should retain good fruit. You should still feel the acidity. It should still have some good aromatics on it. It'll just taste slightly different, and that's just the effect of oxidation over time. It, in some cases, it does, I think, make the wine better, particularly if it's a younger wine that generally you would prefer to age, like a Bordeaux or a Chianti or a Barolo or something like that, where a little bit of extra air will go a long way. For less expensive wines, I don't think it's necessary per se, but it won't hurt you. And you can keep that wine if you plan to keep it for more than a day or two. First of all, like, come on, what are you doing? Just commit. But second of all, you can throw it in the fridge as well, and that will at least slow down the rate of oxidation. Just pull it out a couple hours before you're going to drink it again to allow the temperature to come down. If it's super cold, and this is true of white wine as well, you won't smell or taste as much. It'll just be sort of bright coldness, and you won't really get to taste anything, which is fine if it's a $8 bottle of Pinot Grigio and you're just pounding it in the porch. But if it's something you're interested in, I would say let it warm up a little bit, and you'll have a better experience with it. The suction things, though, they're great. Like I said, Jenn has them for her bar because this is product that she's selling. But if you're just at home and you don't have it, it's totally fine. You don't need it. Exactly. Leftover wine is for suckers. Where were we? Rio Madre. Right. Rio Madre. So this is, all three of these wines are all family owned, estate grown fruit. So they don't buy their grapes from the lowest bidder or anything like that. The Alerce is that's on that label. That's kind of the family name of the winery, and then Rio Madre here is just the specific brand of this bottle. But it's a lot of care, a lot of attention to detail goes into this wine. It does see some oak aging, but they use actually neutral oak barrels, which means barrels that have been used 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So rather than imparting anything into the wine, I don't really taste oak when I drink this wine. Which would be, again, those sort of vanilla, coconut, spicy notes. Instead, what the neutral oak is going to do is just soften some of the acidity. It's not going to be as sharp and bitey. All the little pointy edges of tannin and acidity are mellowed out by some oak aging in those neutral barrels. So you end up with something that still has a nice backbone of acid to it. So it's not just like a flabby fruit bomb. The acidity helps keep it sort of lifted in your mouth, sort of washes across your palate more cleanly, and then when you swallow, you still taste a little something, but it's not lingering. It doesn't coat your teeth. It's not too viscous, anything like that, which is, again, another part of why I love this wine. I remember when I first started working for this company, I tried this wine for the first time at like a trade tasting for restaurant wine buyers up in Steamboat, and I didn't think much of it because it's relatively inexpensive, and I was just sort of like, oh, okay, whatever. But it piqued my interest because it does say on the label Graciano, and as I mentioned, it's super unusual to see that, and so I kind of had to taste it for myself and see what we have here. And what I found was really quite delightful. It has that good medium body. It's not too alcoholic. It's not too rich. It's not too heavy. I think it can do a great job of satisfying someone who maybe wants to move on from Malbec from Argentina, or who enjoys Pinot Noir from Sonoma County, but maybe wants something a little bit heavier and a little bit richer. I think this fits right into that vein. The fruit notes are all pretty blue. I don't get a ton of raspberry. I get more sort of blueberry and plum and those sorts of notes. And it is still fun to just stick my nose in there and smell on it for a while as well, which is sometimes half the fun. So does anyone have any thoughts on this wine? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Yes, 14.5 is no joke. Thumbs up. All right. Any thumbs downs? It's it can be a controversial option. I don't see anyone who willing to talk shit. All right, I'll take that. But super tasty and super unique again. As I mentioned, Graciano is used as a blending grape, and it is part of the blend of the last wine that we'll taste tonight. So we have this 100% Graciano. Our next wine will be 100% Tempranillo. And then the third wine will be a blend of both, along with a couple of other things. And we'll get into that in a moment as well. But for now, Graciano. I guess it's also worth mentioning Graciano does have another name. It is called Carignan. And Carignan is grown predominantly in the south of France, particularly in the Rhone Delta. If you have a nice Côte de Rhone or Châteauneuf-du-Pape or something like that, Carignan is the name they would use for that grape down there. So again, a lot of these grapes have sort of gone back and forth and been interbred and intertwined. So it's really hard to separate Spanish wine from French wine once you start really digging into the history and the nitty gritty of the various grapes. And that's not uncommon at all. There's a very famous Spanish grape called Monastrell, which is super juicy from Jumilla, and they call that Mourvèdre in the Rhone. So a lot of those Rhone grapes made their way to Spain, and they do express themselves very differently, I think, in the soils and climates of Spain. But they tend to, there's just a lot of crossover there, which is always, I think, worth noting.
Always something new. I had no idea. I find that the Spanish winemakers, though, do that a lot. So Tempranillo and Zinfandel, the Monastrell and Mourvèdre. I feel like that I find that they're more, I don't want to say guilty of it, but guilty of it.
I had not heard that Tempranillo
was it's the same grape, but I agree with you 100%. Obviously, they do it in a different style, but yeah. I didn't know that was Carignan, but that also explains why it's usually found as a blending grape, because Carignan typically is found as
exactly.
A grape.
Sometimes you'll see it as a varietal wine, but it's certainly more unusual than just seeing a bottle that says Côte de Rhone, yeah. Which may or may not include Carignan.
Central Coast California right now is definitely known for doing 100% Carignan.
For sure.
And anyone that comes into my bar knows that I love Carignan, and I have it in my fridge often. I will have Graciano as much as I can too.
It can be kind of brambly and dusty sometimes as a grape, so it's nice to see the sort of fresher expression of it as well. Yeah. This is a fairly young wine. The vintage is 18, so it doesn't necessarily speak to me as an old world wine. Although I think if I was blind tasting it, I don't think I would guess it was from California. But I think it does at least appeal to a modern palate, and that's important too, because as fun as it is to drink like weird, funky wines, it's also nice to just enjoy the glass that's in front of you and not have to ponder it too often. As fun as that can be, don't get me wrong. But let's just slide on into the second wine here.
Well, I do have one thing I want to say before we slide on in. Anybody who has bottles that you may have until tomorrow, I actually enjoyed this. I'm not a believer in the chocolate and wine pairing. That's just not my thing. But this one in particular, I got, what was it, Daniel? It was dried cherries and raspberries.
Yeah. And it was really good. A lot of times chocolate and red wine, dry red wine can be bitter and kind of gross. But this was on point. It was super tasty. Yeah, I agree. I don't like chocolate and red wine normally, although it seems like they're a match made in heaven. More often than not, it'll end up tasting like shit. So watch out.
Exactly.
If you're going to do red wine with chocolate, make it a sweet dessert wine like port.
Oh, I'm going to have some port tonight. Thank you.
All right. So wine number 2, Ramirez de la Piscina. And last night, my girlfriend is here with us off camera, and she was like, Piscina, doesn't that mean swimming pool in Spanish? And I was like, yeah, it does, doesn't it? That's weird. Why would they do that? And so I had to actually dig a little deeper to find out that it also means like bath, like Roman bath. And so that's what they're referring to here. So it's not the like public swimming pool that we're talking about here, where it's an ancient bath that we're looking at. Or yes, you can drink it in the pool or the hot tub if you're so inclined. As I mentioned before, this is 100% Tempranillo, which is also kind of unusual in its own right as well, even for a nice Rioja from the western part of Rioja. So we'll go back to our little map here. We're now into the yellow part. So we're in higher elevations here, really in the foothills of the Sierra Cantabria mountain range, which is just sort of the coastal range there. And this one to me speaks to me as a sort of classic old school Rioja. Like if I went back to the beginning of the 20th century, I would expect my Spanish Rioja to taste something more like this. It has old world character, for lack of a better term. You know, it's earthier. It's not all about just opulent fruit. It has a little more structure to it. I sometimes use the word dusty, although, you know, I think that has a negative connotation and I don't mean it that way, but the earthiness has this sort of wet rock, wet stone, you know, rain that's just fallen on hot concrete kind of smell to it. And I'm all about that, particularly when it comes to pairing it with food. I think it does really, really well with, and all of these wines are super food friendly and very meat friendly, very barbecue friendly. Whereas the first one I think would be great with, you know, real kind of wet barbecue that has sauces that are maybe a little sweet, a little spicy. I think this one would do better with just like a straight up smoked brisket or something like that, comes off the smoker, sliced thin, and then some badass Tempranillo with it. So Spanish wine plus barbecue is pretty much always going to be a sure thing. But, you know, just be aware of, are you using sauces or not using sauces and that kind of thing, because that can definitely have an effect on where this goes. In any case, so we're over here, not all the way over. It's like the third little dot there. We're in the village of San Vicente, which is super, super famous. There's a very famous winery in that village that's called San Vicente that makes very expensive Rioja. These guys are just down the road and they make really reasonably priced Rioja for the price. This one is a reserve level Rioja. So that means it's aged in an oak barrel for at least 18 months, and then in the bottle for, I think, at least another year or two beyond that before they can legally call it a Reserva Rioja. Now, because you guys are all regulars at Jenn's, I hope we all at least have some sense of the way appellations work in Europe. You know, in order to put Rioja on the bottle, there's a government agency in Spain that sort of oversees things. And there's a list of criteria that you have to be able to kind of check. Okay, it's made from this place, from these grapes in this way. Okay, you've satisfied all the requirements. Now you can put Rioja on the label. So if you those of you who have the bottles there on the back, you'll notice it has this like cool little hologram thing and it says Rioja and it's got a government sticker on it. And most, you know, the French have something like that. The Italians certainly have something like that. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good wine. They don't make any judgments about the quality. All it means is it's met the various criteria necessary to call it that thing. And it's really about protecting, you know, the place. And America is starting to do this with our AVA system, which is similar to their DOC system, or DOCA in Spain. But it's sort of an emerging thing for us, and it becomes the kind of thing where like you shouldn't call champagne unless it comes from Champagne, you know, and it's easy to just sort of forget these things, but they're passionate about this. There's a lot of history here. It is important to the producers that people understand that they're putting a lot of themselves and their own sort of culture and history into it, and that's kind of where it's coming from. It's not just trying to squeeze more money out of you all the time, though sometimes it is. So like I said, this is a reserve level. And again, for the price to get a really great reserve bottle, and again, we're on vintage 2015 here, and we just got this in probably like 6-7 months ago. So it really wasn't released for a good 4 or 5 years after the grapes came off the vine, because they are super willing to just wait until the wine is ready to release. They have other wines they can sell in the meantime that make it, you know, that keeps the cash flowing, and they can wait until the wine is ready and then release it, which is unusual compared to the French or the Italians, who generally release as soon as they're able and then expect you to just put it in your basement for 10 years and then pull it out when it's ready. As much as I love storing my wine, you know, not everyone has that capability, and it's a long process and it adds time and money and all these other things. Sometimes you just want a bottle of wine that's ready to go, but is also still nuanced and interesting. And Spain is, again, a really, really, really great place to go if you want a great old world bottle of wine at a decent price that's ready to go right out of the gate when you buy it. And that's part of the sort of allure for me of Spanish wine and Rioja specifically. No, I see Jessica notices some oak on this wine. There's absolutely, this has new oak on it for sure. There's like that kind of toasty, vanilla, coconutty little action going on with it. A little bit more spice as well. This wine just has a lot going on. I'm gonna actually have a sip of it because I need to remind myself. But yeah, I immediately, I smell oak on this wine. It's that nice kind of vanilla extracty smell on there. Yeah. And like I said, it does have a little bit more structure. So I think the acidity on the Rio Madre comes through a little bit brighter. This one lingers on the palate a little bit longer. It has that earthiness to it as well. Very sort of mushroomy. I don't know, not to get too wax poetic, but you know, it's got that kind of forest floor, dank, wet earth aspect to it, and I'm all about that. When I think again, old world wines, this is like a no-brainer. If you taste this blind, you should be able to knock this one out of the park. It's an old world wine. If you can find Spain beyond there, great. You know, I might guess that it was like from the south of France, from a Côte d'Aron, something like that, if I was, you know, just sort of blind. But I think it is very clearly an old world wine, and that's super cool. Boom, 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 boom. Cool. Any questions on the Ramirez?
So really quick, so Jeannie is direct messaging, just so you know, Jeannie, you're direct messaging me. I think you mean to send it to everyone, but she said she likes this one. The more I drink it, I taste different things each sip. So just to piggyback on that comment, this is literally the wine that Daniel and I, so we did a wine that was open for 24 hours exactly. And then we opened up another one and had one open that was 24 seconds, maybe 24 minutes, and did side by sides. And this wine in particular is the one. So I guess I should take a step back from what I said earlier about it tasting better. It evolves. I think that I like that when Daniel uses that verbiage instead. It continues to evolve, and every palate is different as to whether you like it from the minute that you open it to the minute that you drink it, like, or an hour later when you drink it, or 24 hours later. This is a great example of oxygenation, I guess, and how it just continues to change its personality. And I love this wine. I actually had it 48 hours later, and then I actually had it a little bit longer than that. I just wanted to continue to keep trying it. And I promise you that this is one of the few wines that continued to evolve, and in my palate preference got better the longer it was open. It's just such a great, solid wine to have. And I don't know. This is my personal favorite out of all three.
This is a badass bottle of wine.
Chameleon, you know?
Sure. And it's cool to see that you guys say, like, you know, I don't know, it's probably the first initial there, but James, J. James. The more you drink it, it changes every time you take a sip. And with wines like this particularly, I think when you have, like, all of you guys seem to have really nice stemware, and that's great. You know, stems are super important because they keep you from holding the bulb of the wine, so you're not getting it too warm, and you just naturally want to start swirling the glass. It's just something you do sort of absent-mindedly as you're holding it. You're just like, oh, what am I doing? Oh, I'm swirling the glass. Every time you do that, the wine will be that much slightly different because you're just dumping oxygen into it, and as it oxidizes, new aromas will start to come out. And rather than this, you know, we look at wine tasting as sort of, you have primary fruit notes and then these sort of secondary notes of, you know, earthiness and whatever, and then tertiary notes start to come out behind that, and those are your weird, like, leather and tar and hot stone and those sort of very deep cuts of aromas, but that really can spike these crazy memories. Like, it's that's the way our brains are wired, is through these aromas. And suddenly you find yourself like reminiscing back to when you were 18 and like your mom and dad took you to Tuscany, or you know, you went to California that one time, or that random glass of wine you stole at Thanksgiving dinner like 20 years ago. Like these weird little memories that just sort of pop. And that's part of why I love wine. I'm sure most wine people would say something similar as well. Is it's just like it brings together all of these various, you know, both scientific, you know, geology and biology and botany and climatology and, you know, all that. But then you also have this sort of poetic, beautiful sort of right brain action that comes into it as well. And I think the synergy of those two things is really cool. And that's part of it.
Partnering with you. I've never actually even said that to you, but I can promise you that Nicole and Jeannie, people who have had the opportunity to be able to taste with me in here. I say it all the time. Tasting is memory sensory. So there's, there's wines that make me think about walking through my grandfather's garden. And it might not be a memory, like it won't be a smell or a taste that evokes something for you, but that's what wine tasting is. And so it's the history, not just worldwide, but your own personal history. And I love that you just said that. It's all about memory sensory.
Yeah, and corgis, because that corgi is super cute there.
I know.
Dog, look at the dog.
Oh, an outfit?
He's got a little outfit on.
That's amazing.
All right, so just to kind of nip the bud on this guy then. So Ramirez, we have a really great value, Reserva level Rioja that is 100% Tempranillo, so they didn't blend in any Graciano or anything else. And we end up with this just gorgeous bottle of wine that's super fun to drink. So down the hatch.
And I've had a couple of people ask if the pricing that's on your sheet is just for the tasting tonight. But if you're doing the tasting, I will honor it for a life, whatever the price is on that sheet. Because it's really stupid delicious and you should be able to enjoy it. And I don't want to make price get in the way between you and your enjoyment.
Absolutely. And that is our little lead into our third wine tonight, which is the Bodegas Muga Rioja Reserva Unfiltered. Pour this one here. In the sort of pantheon of great historic, well-regarded, well-reviewed, much coveted and collected bottles, Bodegas Muga exists and among the best, I would say, probably the top 3 producers of Rioja wine. This is their entry level wine, and it is a reserve level. They don't make anything that less than that. And their wines, this one is not inexpensive by any means. Their high-end wines can be bonkers expensive, super rare, super limited, the kind of thing where as an importer, we get maybe like, 20 bottles of something to satisfy like 6 or 7 different states. They make some really special bottles. This one, fortunately, is a little easier to get your hands on and a little bit more easily priced as well. And this is coming from the village of Haro, Haro. And that is sort of the site of the great producers of Rioja. It's really, really special stuff. They are also very historic. I mean, the Muga family still owns this winery, as they have for generations and generations. So, Juan Muga is the current sort of guy who runs the situation, but his brothers are the winemakers and the viticulturists. So it's a family affair for sure. And they are super cool people, surprisingly grounded for how like fantastically wealthy and incredible they are. And Jen and I kind of went back and forth on this. This is my favorite wine of the 3. It is a very different animal to the Ramirez, though. I think it does have a little bit more of a modern spin on it. I think the oak is a little more pronounced. I don't think it's quite as earthy, not quite as dusty. It's a little juicier, but it is really, really an amazing bottle of wine. So let's start with the sort of nuts and bolts here. As I mentioned a while ago, this is a blend. So it is overwhelmingly Tempranillo, mostly Tempranillo. There is a little bit of Garnacha in it. And again, Garnacha is Grenache, which again, they use in the Rhone Valley. So all those Southern French wines really still getting used here in Spain as well. Garnacha, like any other grape, can be a lot of different things. Most of the just sort of straight up Garnacha that you see comes from a completely different part of Spain that's very arid, very flat, very dry, very hot. And you get these sort of massive big fruit bombs. They tend to be over oaked. I like to use the word slutty to describe them. It's just like these just dripping, juicy, oaky bombs that really don't appeal to me too much. They tend to be kind of cheap and whatever, but they're fine. They serve a purpose. And if all you want is like a decent glass of wine, they do serve that purpose very well. If you're having burgers or pizza or something like that, they're great wines for that purpose, but they're not particularly interesting in my opinion. Grenache, however, just like with the Graciano, when you grow it in the Rioja Alta at those higher altitudes, cooler climates, you're going to end up, the heat on a grape will produce more sugar, and cooler climates will produce more acid. And what we're really looking for is hot days and cold nights. It's what they call a diurnal shift. When you get the hot days, the grape itself develops more sugars, and then it cools down at night. So the sugar is then balanced by the acid. And what that leads to in the final wine is, again, balance, because great wine is all about balance. Sweet wine is awesome. I love sweet wine. A lot of people are poo-poo it or, shy away from it because they think it's going to be gross and cloying. But as long as that sweetness is balanced by acid, you get something that can be really special. Now, there's really not much, if any, sugar left in this wine, but you do get this sort of juicy fruit flavor, and that still needs to be balanced by acidity as well. Otherwise, it will get kind of flabby. And I think flabby is a good word for that type of wine. And I think it's easy to picture what I'm talking about. I hope, cheap Zinfandel or something like that, that just sort of just sort of washes away in your mouth and there's not much left of it. So here, that garnacha is serving a purpose, and it's not to add density. It's merely just to soften, again, some of the rough edges of the Tempranillo that can exist. There's a little bit of Graciano. So again, bringing in that Rio Madre, just a touch of that grape, and then a fourth grape called Mazuelo that is very similar to Graciano. It's used in the same way as a blending grape, and may even have, I didn't take notes on this one, but it may have a French counterpart as well. I should look that up. Well, I'll look it up later. But in any case, they use these grapes in differing percentages every vintage so that year over year, they'll get something that's a little bit more consistent. And that's a really cool way to go about it. Rather than, I think in America, we tend to think of these sorts of things as being more industrialized, and a big, California producer might just use additives to make their wine consistent year over year, versus these old school Spanish or, European producers who are able to just use different grapes in slightly different proportions every year to make something that is always going to have that nice, consistent style year over year. I will get to egg white finey. Give me 1 sec there. Don't worry. So after harvest, everything's done by hand. We move the grapes into the winery. They're all sorted, and some of them are destemmed, some of them are not. And then they use a method which is called pied à cuvée, which I think is referenced on the little tech sheet that Jen provided you guys. And this is a super cool, super unusual process that is very, very old school. And you don't see it too much even in other great European wine producers. And the easiest way to think of it is, if you've ever baked bread at home, a pied à cuvée is like a starter. So they don't inoculate their wines with yeast. Most wineries, they have their grapes, they're crushed, they're ready to go, and they'll just add yeast so that they know, okay, this is what they can sort of count on what the finished product will be. A lot of European wine producers use indigenous yeast, so they'll inoculate with yeasts that are from their specific region, and a smaller subset still use wild yeast and spontaneous fermentation. So out in the vineyards, the grapes, whether it's a vineyard with grapes or an apple orchard or anything, if you go out into these fruit fields, you'll find sort of a weird dust on all of the plants, and there is native yeast just floating around in the air everywhere. And what they do is they take a few bunches of grapes before they harvest everything, and they do a little crush, and they allow that spontaneous yeast fermentation to begin on just that little bunch, and make sure that, okay, this is the type of wild yeast that we want. There's nothing weird going on here. I'm not going to end up with a big barrel of vinegar. This is producing the kind of thing that I want. And then they can add that sort of starter, just like a levain in your bread baking or your sourdough starter. They can add that to their, big vat of crushed grapes, and they know, okay, this is the yeast that's really going to start driving things up, really going to kick things off, and we're going to get our great wine every year. And it's a really cool, it's how, people have been making wine that way for really, truly thousands of years, but they continue to do it today. The wine is fermented in oak barrels, of foudre, these sort of large barrels, and unique to really any other wine producer that I'm familiar with, they have their own cooper. They have their own barrel maker on site. He works for Muga. He only makes barrels for Muga. It's bonkers. Nobody does that. It's super crazy. Remember before how I said the Spanish had figured out that they could bring American oak barrels over and, not have to spend money on the French barrels? This is taking that to like the nth degree at that point. So they have a guy whose job it is to just make barrels for their winery. It's a super specialized skill. It requires years and years and years of training and apprenticeship to do, and they have a guy who just does it for them. But it also allows them to have custom barrels for each year. So if they need more or less surface area to juice of that new oak, they're allowed to really dial in exactly what they need, because they can just be like, hey, yo, Manuel, like we need this size barrel. And he's like, awesome, I'll make that for you, because that's my job. And then they can go from there. So it's super, super cool, super unique. The wine then ferments, and then they can get ready to barrel it into long-term aging barrels. And that is where this egg white fining thing comes into play. So egg white fining, what is fining? Fining is a process by which we introduce proteins to the wine. Those proteins will bond to particulates that are floating out of solution inside the juice. They will grab onto those things, they will surround them, and then they will sink to the bottom. You can use egg whites to do this. For a very long time in the history of wine production, they actually used an extract from fish bladders called isinglass. And then there are modern alternatives as well to both of these things, which are both obviously animal-derived products. Most modern wineries use mechanical filtration instead. So they will pump their juice, their wine, through a screen of some very small size, and they will filter out some of these things. But a lot of wineries, believe, and I believe this myself as well, when you have a mechanical process like that, you are going to end up removing things that you didn't necessarily intend to. And some of the natural spirit of, I will address the vegan question in a sec. You won't necessarily end up with the product that they would have wanted, or a wine as good as it could have been. Now the vegan question, I've worked, a lot of jobs in my career in the wine industry, and, as a lowly retail wine clerk in a liquor store, I can tell you our least favorite questions pretty much in equal measure are questions about sulfur dioxide, sulfites in wine, questions about is this wine gluten-free, and is this wine vegan? And these are complicated questions, and people have a lot of passion about their various beliefs and things. The issue here with adding egg whites to the wine is, and whether or not it's vegan, there is no egg white left in this wine. The whole point of adding egg whites to the juice in the first place is to pull everything out. And so really, once you've racked the juice out of those initial barrels, you've left everything behind by design. If you didn't, you would see it, first of all. And second of all, it would be gross and flawed, and you wouldn't want that. So the whole point of adding egg whites in the first place is that they're gonna not be there in the end. And that's why you use egg whites and not something else, is it's easy to differentiate between them. So instead, at the bottom of these barrels, you end up with a kind of sludge of, egg whites that have bonded with bits of skin, or, bits of seed, or bits of whatever. So there really truly is no protein left in the wine at this juncture. That's the whole point of doing it. However, it has been in contact at some point with an animal product. So if you're like a level 3 advanced, vegan who doesn't eat anything that casts a shadow, like, yeah, you probably have a problem with that. I don't think it's worth addressing necessarily. And if you want to drink fine wine from Europe, you're going to need to find wines that advertise themselves as being unfined and unfiltered. And there are amazing wines out there that do that, but you will end up oftentimes with some gunk, a lot of sediment. You got to be ready to decant. You got to do all these things properly, and it's totally fine. And some of my favorite wines are made that way. Don't get me wrong. But there's something nice about a nice clean wine that hasn't been mechanically filtered, and has had this treatment done to it. And again, this is a process that goes back thousands of years. It's not some way they're trying to like sneak in animal products. They're not like pouring bacon fat in there or anything. It's done very intentionally and with a lot of love and a lot of care. And there's a guy who like just sits there cracking eggs all day, separating whites from yolks. They use them, they do their thing, and then they make custard with all those leftover yolks. Like, there's no waste. It's great. So, if the point of your veganism, I guess, is to like not eat animal products, at least these are farm fresh eggs from their local area, all these good things that are still happening. But has it come into contact with animal products? Yes, it has. So I'm sorry. I always wait until the end. So like, gotcha. If any of you are vegan, psych, sucks to be you. But I hope you would agree that the wine is worth it. And if you pull out like some egg white, I'll be surprised and I'll buy you a new bottle of something else, I promise. But the whole point really is that there's nothing left over. So then we move into the barrel aging process here. So we're looking about 2 years of barrel aging and then at least another year of bottle aging before they'll release it. So again, the wine's ready to go right out of the gate. If you were so inclined, you could definitely lay this down in your wine cellar or in your wine fridge or in your basement or whatever for, a good 5 to 10 years. I wouldn't say it'll last for like decades and decades the way other wines in the world might. But that's not the point of this wine. It doesn't need that. As I said, they release it when it's ready to go and it's ready to go. I love this wine. Like I said, I think the oak's a little more pronounced, but it remains in balance. It's not too heavy. It's not too light. It really fits that Goldilocks profile. And I think all of these, let me double check. Where did they hide? Yeah, all of these have the same alcohol content as well. So in terms of body, they're all more or less on the same page, which is kind of cool as well. So texturally, it feels richer, but that's not a result of alcohol. A lot of times alcohol makes a wine feel heavier, but here it's other things going on. Probably egg white, now that I think about it. That's what makes it feel rich. Just kidding. And that is the Bodegas Muga Rioja Reserva. I really I can't express how much I love this wine. I hope it comes through in my passion for it because it is a super, super delicious bottle of wine. Every vintage, I've had maybe 3 or 4 vintages of this wine over the last 5 or so years, and it always delivers every time. I've never once had it, even in 2014 was kind of a cooler, more challenging vintage. It was still amazing. It really doesn't matter the year. They're always going to make a good bottle of wine. And as I understand it, 1 or 2 of you maybe went to Bodegas Muga once. Who was that? Is that someone here?
Yeah, it was Monica and Ryan, but they are muted and unvideoed. So
Other 6 non-video participants? Jeez, coward.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because they have a super cute, whether or not Monica has her hair done, like they've got a super cute puppy too, which we also just saw yours.
We're here.
Behind you.
Yeah, all right, cool. So I never had the pleasure of going to Muga. I've certainly seen tons of pictures, and as I understand it, and I hope you would confirm this for us, not only is the winery itself really kind of cool and both modern and classical looking, but the area around it as well is very dramatic. You have these crazy rock formations and
oh, Allison, what's up?
Howdy.
How are you guys?
Brush your teeth after this wine.
I will, I swear. That's my dentist, everyone.
Oh.
your dentist.
That's
Yep.
Schmitz, Matt Schmitz.
We're talking. Yes, no. The whole landscape is really cool. It's surrounded by mountains. But then this winery in particular, it's like on not a cul-de-sac, but a circle, and there's like 7 other bodegas around it. And so when I went, you can just walk around and hit a ton, and you happen to get really drunk because they're really close to each other. So
that'll happen. Muga is also really cool. I've set up a lot of visits and appointments for people who travel to Spain, and they're like, they Google Muga and importers and they see our name and they contact us and they're like, hey, like I'm going to Spain, like can you help me set up a winery tour? And they're super cool about that as well. You can just set them up on their website even. So when the world calms down, if you find yourself in Rioja, you should definitely check it out. It should be pretty beautiful. And were I to go to Spain, this would definitely be top of my list. Really, if you just work your way from the eastern part of Rioja all the way west to the coast in Galicia, I think you would probably have a pretty great adventure. And that's what I intend to do the next time I go to Europe as well.
When you said that whole section, the Rioja, the 3 DOCAs are about the width of Connecticut, just to give everyone a perspective of.
Yeah, if that. Really like very, very narrow. I think Americans have trouble conceiving of just how small Europe is relative to the US, because you can go from like France into Switzerland into Italy and speak like 4 different languages in that span of time. And yet you've gone the distance from like Colorado to like Salt Lake City. And you're just like, wait, what the hell is going on here? So, you know, the actual distances of these places is very small, particularly because Rioja is a river valley. So really it's an area, you know, maybe 20, 30 kilometers in either direction, north and south of a river that just sort of runs east to west. Interestingly as well, it sits along a very famous pilgrimage route, where people would come down from the Pyrenees from France and from parts east, further east in Europe. It's part of this sort of pilgrimage route that you would take to Galicia in the northwest of Spain, that little like nubbin that hangs over Portugal. And Rioja is right dead smack on that path as well. And so I think that definitely contributed to Rioja entering the sort of zeitgeist of the wine world, as well as people were just passing through there. And, you know, as they would do so, they'd be like, wow, the wine here is actually pretty good. And then they would take those stories home with them, or, you know, they would write down about it in their journal or their book about their pilgrimage, if they were lettered. And I'm talking, you know, Renaissance era and before. You know, it was known around that time, as well as people started to write about it, and really for that reason, which is kind of cool. Does anyone think this wine is their favorite, or is everyone a Ramirez fan more than this one? I see Juan the dentist.
Do you like this third one the best?
Yeah.
You're the best.
Two.
I just asked everyone to unmute just so that we can all have like a conversation instead of.
We can open it up, I think, at this point.
I loved all of them were absolutely delicious. 2 was my favorite, but I am a Tempranillo person. So also this is one of my favorite Tempranillos I've ever had.
Nice.
Yes. But so that's my favorite, but all of them were amazing.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that. And Tempranillo is just a delicious grape. I've had like a random like weird Tempranillo from like Central California. I've had Tempranillo from Western Colorado. I've had Tempranillo from Texas, and they're okay. But this guy, I mean, Tempranillo from Rioja is about as good as it's ever going to get. And like I said, when we're looking at value for money, Spain. Just watch out for those big over-extracted fruit bombs of Garnacha. You know, if it says it's from Aragon, or if it says it's from Campo de Borja or something like that, yeah, it's going to be cheap, but it won't be interesting necessarily. And I think these Tempranillos from Rioja just add a little bit more depth. They're a little bit more fun. And if you do want to just take one extra moment and kind of swirl and sniff, you're going to get a better experience out of it as well. And ultimately, I think we can drink anything. You know, we're not going to drink alcohol, but if we're going to drink something, it might as well also have like a story to tell. And again, that's part of why we're attracted to wine in the first place. Is it's more than just a beverage. It is, you know, Liquid Geography is a brand name of a wine that I just love, because it encapsulates a place and a moment in time. And when you drink old wine, you know, it makes you think back to all the things that have happened between now and when the grapes were actually harvested. I had the fortune to drink a bottle from 1992 last week, you know, German Riesling that was absolutely mind-bending and super delicious, but also thinking about what I've done in the past, you know, Jesus, almost 20 years. You know, this just shit, 30 years. I'm old.
Yeah.
But you know, that becomes part of the conversation as well. And to just again go back to the fact that the Spanish producers are super willing to sit on their wines in the cellar longer, it just gives you that much more access to an aged wine without having to put it away somewhere and forget about it and kind of be bummed about that. But that you can go to the store and buy a 2011 Muga Prado Enea, and it'll be expensive, but it won't put you in the poorhouse, and it will be a truly like, you know, transcendent experience. Someone mentioned the charcuterie as well. All of these wines, as I mentioned, are great for meat and things like that, or anything with char and off the grill, but anything also that's kind of gamey. I think does really well with these wines. So if any of you are hunters and you got some elk or, you know, venison or bison, or certain sausages, I think one of the like there's a Wagyu sausage in the charcuterie plate from Jenn tonight that maybe has just a little bit more kind of gaminess to it, is perfect for these wines, because the wines themselves almost have this irony kind of bloody note to them as well. And that really can pair very, very well. So yeah, so something else to consider as well. Always be thinking about what you're going to eat with them. You can always just drink on its own, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, good meat, good cheese. There's a reason why we associate these things with wine. Like a nice piece of Manchego cheese and any of these wines is going to rock your socks off. If you get some nice Iberico ham, like it's going to be amazing no matter what. You can't help it.
I have a question for you, not to like put you on the spot by any means, but I had something a little bit spicy and it was actually making me, are there any reds in particular or any of these three, I think you mentioned it earlier, that you would pair with something spicy? Because I feel like for me, I'm always pairing spicy white with more, you know, like a off dry Riesling or something of that note. But I mean, I'm not gonna not eat spicy in the winter months. I'm also not drinking necessarily something that's off dry.
Totally.
Is there a red in particular that you would pair with something spicy?
You know, it depends on what it is, I guess, first and foremost. You know, Jenn mentioned the sort of classic easy go-to pairings for spicy food, off-dry Riesling, Gewürztraminer, anything that what you want to balance spice is sugar. Sugar will tame spice. And what I'm talking about, like real heat here as well, not just sort of like, you know, I used saffron or something, not that kind of spice, but like hot spice. More often than not, like if you go to a nice Mexican restaurant and they give you like some really hot serrano peppers or something like that, you're not going to want a wine that's super dry and really honestly like earthy, like the Ramirez. You're going to want something that's really round and juicy around the edges, something that has those sort of dense dark fruit notes. That would be a good time to actually start heading in the direction of those less expensive garnachas I mentioned, from those hot climates, where they're cheaper, they're juicier. You know, they're not going to be too dry, they're not going to be tannic. You want to avoid tannin for sure, so nothing too grippy, nothing that makes you kind of feel tight in your jaw. So of these three wines, I would say the Rio Madre is probably the way to go. But you do also want to watch out with the acidity. You know, the Rio Madre, I think, has a nice balance of acid to fruit, but that acidity with spice can sometimes be a little overwhelming as well, because the spice and acid are kind of on the same page versus like juiciness and sweetness. Whether or not that sweetness is due to sugar or just our tricking our brains into thinking something is sweet because it tastes like fruit, which is more often than not how we perceive red wine to be sweet, even if there's really no sugar left in it. But red wine is tough with super hot things. I think I would go for the Muga, or I'd go for the Rio Madre on this one, and I would leave the earthiness aside. That's my opinion. I think a good argument could be made for something like Beaujolais or something like that as well. But if we're looking at strictly Spanish wines, these three, I think those two would be the way to go. Or again, a well-oaked Garnacha from somewhere hotter and flatter and drier in Spain would probably be a good option as well.
More fruit forward, like Monastrell and Garnacha.
Exactly. Yeah, Monastrell, Priorat, some of those just sort of juicier options.
Cool. I feel like I'm hogging you. Does anybody have any questions that I'm not hogging?
Yeah, open it up, y'all. Starting to get a little drunk too, so like, you know, don't be afraid to lean in.
I just think I learned so much. I love it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Nicole. She's a top fan.
Yeah, I think I've seen you.
Nicole, you know Nicole, Daniel.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, for sure.
We've met in the bar.
Yeah, at least once.
At least once. Yeah.
No judgment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm judging you, Daniel. How many times are you in my bar?
Mhm.
Too many. Too many.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? I don't want to cut the night short. I mean, it is Friday at 9:15. We have nowhere I mean, everywhere to go tonight is what I meant to say.
Yeah, right. I'm sure you all are going to the club tonight.
Amber.
Get really close together with a bunch of strangers and
If
breathe.
only I could like wander down a block.
Right, right.
I know. If only you could put a mask on and wander down the block. The door is locked.
I'm vaccinated now.
Oh, yay.
Oh yeah. Amber is frontline. Thank you, Amber.
Yes, and I'm
Awesome.
remembering, Amber, you and I met like a couple weeks ago.
So I'll keep everyone updated, but
Yeah.
I'm
You're
gonna-
doing okay? You're
Oh,
doing
yes, it's fine. Don't even get me started.
okay.
Don't
Good.
worry about it.
It's because
I'm
of the wine.
Yeah.
The
It's the wine.
protected her. The wine is my vaccination.
Yeah.
It's kept all of the bad stuff away from me.
Import some Pay Charmant.
Some what?
Pay Charmant.
Hey, Charmant
I don't know that one.
It's from the Dordogne region.
from Dordogne. All right.
I don't
As
know.
interested as I would be in tasting that wine, the idea of selling a wine from Dordogne, as delicious as I'm sure it is, does not appeal to me.
I think that's
The
probably
most interesting wines in the world are more often than not the hardest to sell. And the more obscure you get, the harder it gets a lot of times. We don't work with France at the moment, although you never know what the future holds. But we'll certainly keep that in mind.
We didn't even invite him over.
Yeah, I don't know him.
I was told not to request it.
Well, if nothing else, it's a sweet name drop.
Yeah.
And, that part of France tends to be better known for its spirits. But why not some badass wine from there too?
And why not? Wine, not.
Why not?
There's a question about Ribera del Duero.
Oh, cool. If you're into Tempranillo,
Sorry, Duero. I didn't mean to misspeak versus
if you
traditional.
like Tempranillo, you should also be, in addition to Rioja, drinking wines from Ribera del Duero. It is a little bit cooler than Rioja for the most part. Rioja Alta is a little bit on the cool side for sure at the altitude, but the Duero, I mean, again, talking about great value wines for Tempranillo.
My God, yeah.
Ribera del Duero is absolutely phenomenal. I used to work with a wine called Emilio Moro, which I believe is still pretty well distributed in this state. And even their least expensive bottle of wine is 100% Tempranillo, and it is bonkers delicious. Really elegant, really light relative to, I think, some of these Riojas. I think the oak influence is a little less pronounced in most of Ribera del Duero, at least at the lower price points. And then the higher end wines are up there with the best of anything. Vega Sicilia, I think, would be the most famous and most expensive example, and really hard to find. But really the sort of bargain $20-ish bottles from Ribera del Duero are absolute stunners every time. And then if you want to kind of continue your exploration of Tempranillo grapes as well, there's another region called Toro, which is just to the west of Ribera del Duero. And they call the grape Tinta di Toro in Toro, but it's still Tempranillo, but it is a completely different animal, a completely different expression. It's much heavier, really dense, really rich. For your like Napa Cab drinkers or, California Cabernet drinkers are going to feel right at home in Toro. But to have like a Toro wine, a Ribera del Duero wine, and a Rioja side by side, and to know they're all Tempranillo and they're all completely different, is a really fun way, again, to start looking at why the Europeans focus less on the grape and more on the place, because it's all about expressing, terroir, about the combination of soil and elevation, climate, aspect, what direction it faces the sun, what slope angle it's on, all of these things, and the sort of weird alchemy that goes into, I've never met someone who is able to competently say, if I grow this wine in this place in this soil at this time, it's going to taste like this. Because anyone who draws straight lines between those factors and the finished product is a moron, or they're trying to sell you something. But you can at least start to make some generalizations about things and say, okay, wines that grow in limestone soils with good southern exposure on a decent slope so that the grapes get a good amount of sunlight, with hot days and cool nights, with good drainage in the soil will probably make a pretty good wine. You can start to make those types of connections. And I think that's a good way to look at things. And again, why it's so important to focus on places and not grapes so much. It's easy to say like, I love Tempranillo, but I love Tempranillo too, but I also love it when Tempranillo has like other stuff put into it to make it, you know, better or more than the sum of its parts. And that's part of what I think makes wine so interesting as well. It's just that it does become this true alchemy, and it does become more than the sum of its parts. And terroir is kind of a woolly, you know, term. I've seen a lot of people who get really mystical about it, and I don't necessarily subscribe to those notions per se, but I saw like a wine television program some years ago, and the best sort of explanation of it that I saw was talking about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and how in Châteauneuf-du-Pape they have these big red rocks that are on the surface of the soil there, and the Galets Rouges they call them. And in the springtime, those nice big rocks absorb more of the sunshine. And so they warm up the soil a little bit faster than they would if those rocks weren't there. That wakes up the vines earlier. So it increases the growing season for the vines in those particular areas. And when you have a nice long growing season from start to finish, let's say it begins, you know, early as you can get it in the spring, and you harvest as late as you can in the fall, you tend to get wines that are a little bit more interesting, a little bit more nuanced, like Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And you can start at least making some scientific notions versus like, I buried a ram's horn filled with like, you know, manure, and I only harvest under the certain moon cycles and only when Sagittarius is in the house of Venus or whatever the hell. Like, there are wine producers who really follow the biodynamic calendar like that, and they do make great wines usually. But is it because of where the moon was at that moment, or is it because they put so much time and effort into all of these things that they just, you know, fall ass backwards into making something that's super, super awesome? And a lot of the producers we work with do follow the biodynamic calendar. And I've never had a real conversation with them about it. It's always like, wow, that's so cool that you do this. It's never like, do you really need to do that? Like, is this super necessary? But you know, God bless. If the juice is good at the end of the day, that's all I care about. And you know, can I sell it? And the better it is, the easier it is to sell. And I think that makes my life easier as well. But yeah, biodynamics, weird stuff. Cool. Well, let's see. Sanjay asked about Ribera del Duero versus traditional Rioja. I'm just going to loop back to that real quick and say, I think the oak aging program, it tends to be the biggest difference, and then the climate of the two regions. The winemaking style will be more or less the same. As I understand it, Ribera del Duero gets colder faster in the fall, so you do need to harvest a little bit earlier. But winemaking style wise, I think they're more or less on the same page. I tend to see more wines that are 100% Tempranillo from Ribera del Duero. You don't see as much blending of other grapes from that region as well. So the focus really is on Tempranillo and not so much on blending in those other grapes, because you don't really see them grown there too much as well. Nice. Yeah. Muga Selección Especial, Sanjay called out, is another really awesome wine. It's denser and juicier than this one, much more in that sort of Napa Cab category, I think, but way more interesting than that. And really, really inky, dark purple color. Really fun to drink. I have some 2014s and some 2015s. They're fun to drink side by side as well. The oak influence is a little bit more pronounced. I would say it's a much more modern wine than this one, but it is impossible to deny how delicious it is. It's super good. So if anytime you see Muga out there, it's always worth checking out. They make a white wine. Their rosé is really out of control good as well. So if you ever see those out in the wild, scoop them up. They're worth it. They're not crazy expensive, but they're not cheap by any means. And they're always worth checking out. And yeah. Any other questions tonight?
I learned so much, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. My pleasure. It's nice to just see fresh faces. Obviously, this is much more fun to do in a wine bar setting where I can schmooze and be hilarious, as I so often am. But it's nice to just be able to take a moment and connect with a bunch of strangers about something that I'm passionate about. And I imagine you guys are passionate about too, or at least trying to become passionate about it. You know, if you take nothing else away, just, you know, keep exploring wine. It's a wide world out there. Always be willing to spend money on a bottle of wine that isn't your favorite thing in the world. Try to not fall into the habit of becoming a Coke or a Pepsi person and just buying the same thing every time. Be exploring, and, you know, use a bottle you love to help you pick out the next bottle that you're going to love, and use a bottle you hate to help you pick out a bottle you're going to hate less. And just don't be afraid to try new things, and to take advice from wine professionals like Jenn, or if you have a liquor store that you go to and you trust the people there, you know, most of them have tried the things that they sell, and you can ask them like, hey, I had this Muga Rioja, it was amazing, but I don't necessarily want to spend that much tonight. Do you have something that, you know, maybe might fall in the same boat? And they'll get you some really great valued Riojas as well. You know, use, again, that sense of place as your guide, rather than I like Tempranillos, because it can be so many different things. When you say I like Tempranillos, what do you mean? Do you like Tempranillos that are in this style, or do you like Tempranillos that are in that Toro style that are super extracted and really intense? You know, think about places as much as you think about grapes, and just keep trying new things. And if you have a moment, like, snap a picture of labels that you really enjoy, and maybe, you know, have a little moleskin notebook, or a, you know, a composition book that you just write a few words about, you know, I liked this, I didn't like that. It doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to say, I tasted, you know, tomato leaf and, you know, concrete that's just been rained on, the kind of things that I talk about. You don't need to write a poem, but do take note of what you do and don't like, because you will find yourself getting better and better at shopping for wine as well. And once you get to a place where you don't want to ask for help because you'd rather stumble into something cool, that's where I think it really starts to become less of a hobby and more of a passion. And you might find yourself spending more money, but I think your enjoyment will also increase with that as well.